Hello everybody, this is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday, April 27th, and this is the Week 7 announcement for Political Science 1013 on the 8-week schedule for the spring 2025 term. All right, everybody, we're through with Exam 3. We've got a little under 2 weeks left in the term, so we've got to bear down and get ready for the final exam, for term papers for those who are doing them, and for the end of the term, and which I trust everyone will get through successfully. Let's see. Okay, everybody, the final exam will be Thursday the 8th. That is not this Thursday, but a week from Thursday. This Thursday is the 1st. The final exam will be the 8th. Term papers are due the following day, Friday the 9th. And then grades will be turned in the following Monday the 12th, and that will be the end of the spring term. Now, we've gotten a series of announcements out for the final exam and for our last discussion, which for you all is going to be this Wednesday the 30th and Thursday the 1st. Okay. That'll be discussion 5, the last of our 5 discussions. Everybody, the material for the final exam will be Unit 7 on the Supreme Court and Unit 8 on Congress. I want to talk about the Supreme Court unit today, and we'll talk about Unit 8 on Congress next time, along with business I need to go through for the end of the term and for the final exam and the term papers. For the discussion, we're going to go ahead and jump ahead to Congress on Thursday the 30th, on Wednesday the 30th, and Thursday the 1st. You have an interview to read from the New York Times with Senator Lankford, who will be one of the senators, I believe, for most of my students, many if not most. We draw from a 5-state area and beyond, but I imagine many, or if not most of my students in this section are from Oklahoma. And so Senator Lankford will be one of your 2 senators. So look at this interview. This goes back a little while to what Senator Lankford was doing before the election. Senator Lankford was working on an immigration bill, but it turned out Donald Trump, who was a former president and presidential candidate at the time, did not want an immigration bill passed. Okay, so Lankford was trying to work with a couple of other senators, one a Democrat and another independent, to arrive on an immigration bill that Congress might pass. But Republicans in Congress, by and large, didn't want to do it. And Lankford himself is a Republican, so we've asked you to take a look at that interview, and you will learn a fair amount, I think, about Lankford himself, about getting along with Trump, and about being a United States senator. And what we've asked you to discuss is, do you approve of Lankford working with an independent senator and a Democrat on immigration legislation? As I say in the assignment, he seemed to think that that was part of his job description, to work with all senators regardless of party. But Trump and many other Republicans did not seem to be happy with him doing that. Okay, so that will be our last discussion this Wednesday, April 30th, and Thursday, May 1st. The last of 5 discussions we will do over the course of the term. Now, for the final exam, the material will be Units 7 and 8 on the Supreme Court and on Congress, and I've sent links to 4 articles for you to read, 2 about the Supreme Court and 2 about Congress. And I will say a little more about those next time, because we'll be closer to the final exam. But you might look at those and try those links, and maybe even print those articles, so that we're not waiting till the last minute in case there should be some problem with those links. So you might want to go ahead and try those links. All right, so discussion this Wednesday and Thursday. Final exam and the term papers due the following week on the 8th and 9th. Let me spend the rest of our time today talking a little bit about Unit 7 on the Supreme Court. Okay, so we start out talking about the courts in general in the United States. Generally in the federal court system, there are 3 levels. There are the U.S. district courts, There are, I believe, 92 of them. Then above the district courts are the circuit courts of appeal. And we've published a map of the circuits across the United States. And there are 2 circuits located in Washington, D.C. Okay. And then above them, of course, the United States Supreme Court, which we're mostly concerned about. Okay. Most all of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is on appeal. There are a couple of categories where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. States suing each other, cases involving ambassadors, okay, but those are rare enough. Most all of their jurisdiction is on appeal. Okay. They, of course, are a constitutional court. They get to say what is constitutional or not, which we call having the power of judicial review. Okay. The Constitution is the highest law, so any other law or any action that the president or any other official might take can be declared unconstitutional if it's deemed to be in conflict with the Constitution by a majority of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court. So that's a power that you might think would be implied in the Constitution, but the court did not claim that power until 10 or 15 years after the Constitution was in effect, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, 1803. I discussed that to some extent in the class notes. So be aware of that case, Marbury versus Madison, and also in general, the concept of judicial review. Okay? Now, we talk a good deal about how the Supreme Court does its business. There might be a couple of thousand cases appealed to the Supreme Court in every term, which runs from October to June. Okay, so they are about to wind up their current term in the next few weeks. Out of those thousands of cases, they might take somewhere between 50 and 200. I think it's been around 60, 75, 100 in recent terms, but they could take more than that. But they don't take anything approaching all of the cases that are appealed to them. And so if they decline to take a case, then the decision of the lower court stands. Okay? Now, we talk about how they do their business. Cases are scheduled for oral argument on a rotating basis. Generally, the 2 sides only get 30 minutes each before the Supreme Court. Then, once they've been argued orally, they are discussed in conference until we arrive at a point generally where there's one opinion offered that attracts the support of a majority of them, at least 5. That can take some time. Be familiar with terms such as majority, dissenting, and concurring opinions. Okay, that's all discussed in your class notes. Now, one very important thing that I stress and spend a good deal of time on in this unit is the political nature of the Supreme Court. Now, some people think it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court has become so politicized. People will say, well, it's not a political institution, it's a legal institution. Be that as it may, we tend to think of them as a mini legislature, and we evaluate them according to the political party of the presidents who appointed them. So right now, people tend to speak of the Republicans as having a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. Now, they would tell you that although there's a political aspect to their work, they're not supposed to work just in the same way that a legislature does. Okay, there's a political element to it, but it's most certainly a legal institution. Very often, they split along those lines. Okay, 6 Republicans versus 3 Democrats, but often they do not. And they would be very quick to tell you that. Okay, sometimes most all of them are in agreement. Sometimes they cross what you think would be the political lines. But it's probably the issue of abortion that has contributed to politicizing the Supreme Court more than anything else, going all the way back to the 1970s when the Supreme Court stepped into the abortion issue. That's not all it is. Okay, there are many, many other what we might call hot button issues that tend to make the Supreme Court a political football. Okay. One thing we have seen in the past 50 years, when a vacancy occurs, when the president needs to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court, that is always discussed in the press and in public in political terms. Okay. Prospective candidates may be discussed until the president makes the nomination, and they will be discussed in terms of whether they are liberal, conservative, or middle of the road. And these days, of course, Republicans tend to appoint ones who are regarded as conservative, Democrats, justices who are regarded as liberal. Okay, although the Supreme Court justices themselves, I think, regard that whole discussion as kind of awkward. But be that as it may, those 9 places on the Supreme Court have become big political prizes, and they are always discussed in political terms when a vacancy comes up. Sometimes nominations are made as a way of giving recognition to one or another group in the population. I mentioned in the class notes at various times, one or more places on the Supreme Court have been regarded as either the Catholic seat or the Jewish seat. In contemporary times, that tends to be more a matter of race and ethnicity and gender. Okay? We now have 4 women on the Supreme Court. Okay? There were only 2 women on the court before these 4 who are currently serving, Justice O'Connor and Justice Ginsburg. Okay? When Justice O'Connor was appointed by Reagan, she became the first woman on the court, and her seat was spoken of as the female seat on the court. Well, now there are 4, so it's not clear how valid that is anymore. Now, Clarence Thomas is in the place on the court. He was preceded by Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African-American justice. And that place on the court has come to be spoken of as the black seat on the Supreme Court, because it was felt that African-Americans deserved enough recognition as to have at least one place on the Supreme Court. We have Justice Sotomayor, who may be regarded as holding the Hispanic seat on the court. There's nothing formal about that, but it's something informally that has developed through the years. There'll be an expectation that prominent groups within the population, minority groups especially, may get recognition in the form of one or more places on the Supreme Court, and recently that's applied to women as opposed to men. And we discuss several examples of that in the class notes. Now, it is unavoidable that, as we said, that these things become discussed in political terms. Now, as we go through the class notes, you read about, and I discuss, several of the big controversies that have occurred about filling nominations to the Supreme Court. One of the first big ones was over Judge Robert Bork, who ended up not being confirmed. Reagan nominated him to the court just a few years after the Roe versus Wade decision. Bork was asked, he's dead now, but at the time he was asked why he wasn't confirmed. They thought I would overturn Roe versus Wade. The hearings were very acrimonious, and eventually he was voted down. He was not confirmed. Another justice was appointed, but there was a controversy about whether he had smoked pot in the past, something that might not be as big an issue today. Finally, Justice Anthony Kennedy was appointed and confirmed to the place that Bork would have occupied on the court, and Kennedy stepped down a few years ago. Okay, Clarence Thomas, okay, to replace Thurgood Marshall. Well, there was a tremendous amount of controversy about Clarence Thomas's behavior earlier in his career. He was accused of having committed sexual harassment against a woman named Anita Hill. They had both worked together in a government agency, and she came before Congress and testified in a very sensational manner. I put both their pictures, they were on the cover of Time magazine, and that's in the class notes. Okay. He eventually was confirmed in spite of all that. Okay. The 3 justices that Trump appointed in his first term, those appointments all were accompanied by one degree of controversy or another. It was tremendously fraught, and there was a feeling that Trump strong-armed a couple of these people onto the court. Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, their nominations are all discussed in the class notes, and you read about what made those nominations controversial. Okay. All right, so we can't keep the politics all out of the Supreme Court these days, it seems, for better or worse. Now, after all that, I discuss several of what we call landmark Supreme Court decisions, okay? Meaning historic decisions where the Supreme Court has stepped in and had a big influence on our system, on our daily lives, and our politics. Okay? And we mentioned the court can do that when it gets an appropriate case and feels it's appropriate to do so. But remember, they're a reactive institution. They have to wait until they get an appropriate case. But there have been some very dramatic landmark cases through the years. We discuss the case of Brown versus the Board of Education from way back in the 1950s, okay, when the court ruled that formal segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. So you could no longer operate one set of schools exclusively for black students and another set of schools for whites. Okay, an important decision. We discussed the abortion decisions, Roe versus Wade, going back to the 1970s, which now has been reversed by the Dobbs decision of just a couple of years ago. Okay, there was the Citizens United decision that let a lot of big money into politics because the Supreme Court, up to a point, bought the argument that money equals speech, and to restrict money in certain senses would be tantamount to restricting our freedom of speech. Now, there are still restrictions on what candidates and parties can do, but restrictions on independent organizations were lifted. And those organizations have come to be known as super PACs, and they are pretty much unlimited in the amount of money that they can contribute to individual candidates or political parties. So the Citizens United decision was what allowed the influence of super PACs and the money that they generate and give out in our political system. Then there was the Obergefell decision, which said that states had to allow for same-sex marriages. Now, Justice Kennedy, who we mentioned, wrote the majority opinion. Chief Justice John Roberts did not agree with him, and we have excerpts of both of those opinions in our class notes. Finally, just recently, I discuss in the class notes the Trump versus United States decision. Now, this is a decision that some people say has let the president do just about anything, making the president above the law. That is a matter of dispute. Justice Sotomayor, in dissent, said that, well, maybe the president could order the Navy SEALs to go assassinate one of his political opponents, and he could not be punished. Okay, well, that's a controversial view. Look at what the court said. Okay, presidents can be prosecuted for unofficial acts, and the court said not all their acts are official. For instance, some acts a president might perform could be in their capacity as a political candidate rather than as president. So conceivably, Trump could still be prosecuted after he leaves office for interference in the 2020 election, which was what Special Counsel Jack Smith was trying to prosecute him for. But Trump's got the control of the Justice Department now, and that has been stopped for the time being. Then there are president's official acts, and the Supreme Court said for the president's core constitutional duties, he has absolute immunity from prosecution. For other official acts, there's presumptive immunity. In other words, there's the presumption that he's immune, but that presumption presumably could be overcome somehow if the illegality of the act were egregious enough, we might suppose. So they divided presidential acts into three categories. But for core constitutional duties and acts related to that, they said presidents could not be prosecuted. All right, so take a look at and see what you think of all of that. Once again, discussion Wednesday and Thursday, our last discussion of the term, with the final exam and the term paper due date coming up the following week to wind up the term. We'll talk to you a little more about the final exam next time, and we'll try to say a little bit about Unit 8 on Congress to wind this up for the spring 2025 term. So, study hard, take it easy, contact me as needed through the course website or at david.cole@opsu.edu. We'll talk to you once again about a week from now at this time.